So thank you all for joining the webinar for our Call for Evidence, our Facilitating Connections Call for Evidence. And this is a rescheduled call from last week's webinar, where we had some technical issues that restricted the number of people that could dial in. It was restricted to 25. Unfortunately, restriction that was out of our control and not the facility we asked for. So apologies for those of you who set their time aside and couldn't connect. I can see with the number of people on our connection hit screen here, we've got a significant number of people over 25 now. So thank you for your patience last time. Thank you for connecting again. And hopefully we'll have a good session today. I'm going to cover some house rules first that will hopefully help the webinar and the WebEx run smoothly. So firstly, can we ask everybody to go to mute? We here will go to mute shortly. But if everyone's in mute, then that will allow Carl Murchie from FSEN to present and run through the slides that we've got today. So if you all go to mute, then that would be great. If we see that people aren't on mute, we'll control that here as well and put you on mute. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Now, because you're all going to be on mute, we would like to hear your questions and get your feedback as we go through. So hopefully you can all see the online chat facility that we have on the webinar on the right-hand side of your screen. There is a send to box, a free text box underneath that. If people would like to send in questions as we go through, please do that. Please send to everyone so that everyone can see the question. And then we can all see what's being sent in, and hopefully Kyle will answer your question. We'll pause at suitable points through the presentation, and if Kyle doesn't draw breath, I'll ask him to pause for a second. So we will give you an opportunity to ask questions to go through, and then
9023.
Hopefully we'll have some time at the end. Okay, I don't think there's anything more for me to add as an introduction. So, Kyle, I'll hand over to you. We'll go to mute for the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. So, thank you very much for everybody for joining. The purpose of this webinar is really to discuss the Facilitating Connections work, which this particular project team has been looking at. It's part of the ENA Open Network project in what is known as Workstream 1. So Workstream 1 is looking at the transmission and distribution interface, the type of data we're going to require. And
Kyle, can I just interrupt? I can hear someone typing quite heavily over your voice. If we could reiterate the mute for everyone, please.
That's great, thank you. It wasn't me typing. I'm not doing some other work at the same time. So, so ultimately it's a particular piece of work which is being kicked off this year. We have now got a particular call for evidence, so that is the call for evidence which is currently out, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have this particular webinar to kind of run through ultimately where we're at, what results we've got to date, and basically walk through and understand what types of questions, what types of responses we're actually really looking for, because ultimately this particular piece of this call for evidence, this consultation, the results that come out of this from the wider stakeholders will be fed directly into the next piece of work. And it's at this stage we're trying to understand from the wider stakeholders really what it is that's ultimately needed. The evidence that can be provided will really help allow us to shape the next piece of work, which ultimately will have the benefits for both DNOs, National Grid and the wider stakeholder group. Importantly, the consultation or call for evidence is actually out there, so it was launched on the 30th of April. We're still quite a bit away from the closing date, and that's the 11th of June at 5 p.m, so still plenty of time to ultimately write down some responses to those questions and get those in. I just want to stress that in addition to this particular call and the questions that come on the back of this call, we are looking still for responses to come in formally through that particular method, for the call for evidence. We will be noting any questions, and anything that can't be answered here particularly well or fully will certainly be picked up, and a response will be sent out ideally next week to cover those off. So if I move on to the next slide. So I just want to run through what questions we already had, so that people might get, so we don't ultimately cover the same ground ideally. So these are the questions that were from the initial webinar that we had. We were able to look some questions. One was obviously just sending out the link to the consultation, which is actually within this document, and we'll certainly include that as well on the publication. So that can be covered. The second one that was then talking about, is it likely that the roadmap and good practice document prepared at the end of this year will emphasise in renewables and storage, or is it going to be technology neutral? The response to that question really was that, I suppose a bit of both. It does need to be technology neutral. It's not going to focus on, it's not going to just cover storage, for example, on its own. It will try to create a process and to give good practice for all participants looking to provide a particular service, because it's recognised that even more traditional technologies could actually provide a service, of course, as we move into the DSO environment. So this will cover as many, ultimately try and be technology neutral. But yep. Hello. If anybody can just go on mute, please, that'd be great. So in terms of actually focusing on renewables and storage, this is ultimately a particular piece of work that will have to focus on some of the new technologies coming out. So there will be a slight focus on that, but ultimately, if you were any type of connection customer looking to provide a flexibility service, you should be able to get some benefit and some clear answers out of this piece of work. In terms of where you can find more information on the import-export queues and how they work in detail, there are common charging methodologies out there, and obviously, as it says in the title, there are commonalities between all licensees within that particular document. However, there are variations when you get down to the details. So interactivity processes are a bit different, and some of all those timescales are generally similar. Some of the offerings are a bit varied. So while there's kind of individual documentation there, what we're trying to do in this particular piece of work and coming out of the product 11, as we call it, which will be creating an overall guide for connecting any future flexible resources, will actually either direct you to those particular pieces of material where the detail, it's not relevant to cover the detail in a separate report, or where there are those similarities, we will try and flag and summarise those key points. So what we will do is make a list of those key documents that are currently out there, and in the formal response to this, which will come out next week on the ENA's website, those will be listed. In terms of the call for evidence, there was a question about the call for evidence, question 5, referring to the findings of the DNOs and ask if you agree with them. There was a question on what exactly are the findings, what are the details. In the report itself, in the consultation document, there is a summary of those kind of high-level findings, which we're really looking to get that discussion going more at that level. Certainly, what we don't want to do is kind of preempt the actual responses and make them a little bit too closed. Having said that, some of the responses will, or some of the data we've collected so far will also be published on the ENA's website shortly. But at this stage, we're really focusing on that particular consultation and what the wording and the findings that are in the consultation itself. And then the final one we've had so far was, will the next stage cover situations where there are two schemes in a queue that result in no network impact when combined? So this is the concept of having, let's say, a generation customer and a demand customer, very simple representation, but ultimately if the net impact on the network is zero from a capacity perspective, and there's no other constraints in terms of fault level or anything else, then is there a potential that actually that particular scenario could be treated slightly differently? That is something that will be covered in the next steps, and as part of the roadmap, we are looking at understanding in what situations could could we promote, and what would the impact be for all parties. So that is something that will be picked up. So that just kind of covers where we are just now. So going to the background, which is on slide 4. So why on earth are we starting off with this particular piece of work? Why is it something that's been pulled out and given special focus, so to speak? Ultimately, we understand as licensees that through the last regulatory period, DPCR5 and into WS1, there has been quite a bit of change and move away from your traditional connection options, with single generation. Just we can, in the past we were able to ultimately understand what the diversity would be, what those particular customers, how they would act, and what the market was for them. Obviously, we're changing very quickly, and there's been quite a lot of rapid change in recent times, particularly in the last couple of years when the EFR tender came out. That ultimately triggered a huge kind of reshuffle and rethinking of how we can ultimately treat connections in a queue, because at that time we were definitely in a new world, and so was the SO and also a lot of our stakeholders. So coming out of the Smarter Systems and Flexibility Plan, which was published in July 2017, created by BEIS and Ofgem, there was a particular issue and action, issue 1.6, which was stated in that particular document, and there was also a call for all licensees to really move on, to take network operators industry to continue that improved process and ultimately look at the kind of end-to-end framework and understand if there are any opportunities to better move flexible services and flexible offerings in a queue. How can we, are there any opportunities to ultimately enhance that particular process? If anything, there were a couple of other documents. There was a consultation in particular on the ICE plan, which was provided, publicly available from Ofgem. Again, in the same sort of time, July 2017, which went a little bit further than that. It actually called out and used the word promotion and barriers. So again, this particular piece of work was saying, right, okay, coming off the back of that, if all licensees agree that we need to look at this, then let's look at it combined as one. Let's not have a separate working group for this specific topic, and let's bring it into open networks. We need to look at what the situation is now, but also moving forward as more and more flexible services are going to be offered and the system is updated to facilitate that. It makes sense to ultimately bring that this discussion into that particular piece of work. So that's where we are at the moment, and we have all committed to addressing the fair treatment of flexibility through this collaborative effort. So if I go into slide 5, so the product outcomes, so what are we actually going to achieve? So, yes, sir.
Just before we move on from that, Helen has asked a question around the findings, which hopefully you can see on the chat side. Do you want to cover that now or cover that later in your slide deck, just so that Helen knows you're going to cover it later?
Yeah, I can just, I'm trying to have a look, unfortunately, because I can only see one screen. I can only see my slides. I can't see the I can't see the chat box.
I'll ask the question on
that would be ideal. Yes, I think that would work quite well.
So the question from Helen is it's still not clear from the consultation document what the findings are. Would it be possible to clarify what the findings are as part of this call? It may be down to some wording being a bit vague in the document, but is there something you can, either now or later on, maybe if you could just intro a little bit about findings and what we mean by findings, and then I know you've got a slide later on, and then we'll field any further questions later on.
Sure. Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll pick that up later on. I was a bit further on in the discussion, because I do, as you say, I've got a slide which covers that, so I can make sure we try to pick up those points. That's great. So slide 5, the initial facility and connections piece of work, which is known within the group as Product 10, is really what we're discussing today. This is the the piece of work that's been done to date and the consultation and call for evidence that we're now discussing. Really, what we were trying to do in this particular piece was definition of the problem or opportunity, understanding whether it really is a problem or whether there are more opportunities to be, in terms of moving particular flexible connections, advancing them and getting them ultimately the best connection available in the shortest time frame. Clarification of the present treatment of flexibility, how DNOs, and this does focus predominantly on DNOs at this stage. The next piece of work will also include more transmission and pull on some of the transmission learning as well. And then kind of outlining the next steps to be considered, and a lot of that will come out the back of the evidence that we get, hopefully from this particular call. We have a reasonable understanding of where we think that the direction of travel, so that's already been kicked off, and that particular next piece of work has been kicked off. But it's important to make sure that we're taking on board as much feedback as possible from our wider stakeholders so that it is as relevant as possible. That particular piece of work will consist of developing a connections guide for flexible resources. So that's something that we can kick off right now, and basically that's talking more about the current process across licensees and giving you a clear understanding of, if you were looking to have a flexible connection, it gives you that initial go-to document, which gives you a good overview of all the different options, and also highlighting where there's additional information in, from other DNOs on their websites or wherever that happens to be. So the types of points that it will discuss, will include co-location. If you've already got a particular site and you're looking at co-location of two technologies, it will also discuss that question we had earlier in terms of two particular connections in the queue that actually ultimately offset one another, how that would be treated. So there are lots of things that will be coming out of that particular document and ideally kind of go-to guide. We'll then be going into identifying those gaps, so really the gaps between what comes back from the feedback and where we are at present. If we need to build medium-term and longer-term view on that, because some of the responses we've already had kind of indicate something that it's certainly a situation we'd like to get to, but it's probably not something we will be able to do within the next, even within potentially the ED1 phase. It's going to be likely requiring more code changes, and even as we get into ED2 and having those systems in place to actually allow a move to operate that particular flexible services. It's therefore likely that we'll take some of those and map them out into the longer term. And then importantly, we were wanting to just review and align the roadmap against separate queue management work. There's other queue management work going on within open networks, which looks specifically at the queue. So importantly, this is talking more about the movement of flexible connections. So ultimately, if you're looking to come along and provide a flexible service, how you can get the best connection possible in that early phase. So from, ultimately looking at the site and understanding the information coming out of the licensees and being able to then go through the connections application process, that's really what this is trying to assist with. In terms of the queue, once you're in the interactivity queue and then beyond into construction, that's being picked up by the queue management piece of work. So this is more about the movement of a particular scheme within the existing queue process. If I now move on to the opportunity. So what we try to do, as I said, is define what we believe is the opportunity. So I'll run through this and then kind of open up to kind of questions at that point, and we'll then be covering off some of the findings in a bit more detail. So this is, I've tried to keep it as simple as possible, but hopefully detailed enough that it articulates the thinking well enough for everyone to understand. So on the left-hand side, we've just got the application, the applications by application date. So at the top, you've got the oldest application, the newest one coming in from the bottom. As we move up that particular queue, you've got the phase that we're looking at here is that application queue to construction queue phase. So that's basically when the time between you putting your application in, getting an offer, and moving through to acceptance. The green line at the top is ultimately, once you've reached acceptance, then moving forward into the construction queue. We've broken it down, tried to keep it simple, just looking at import and export, not looking at any other features such as ramp rates and compliance with some of the other codes, that just to try and make it as simple as possible, because there are other reasons why there might be reinforcement triggers such as fault level, etc. But we'll just look at import and export for simplicity here. And importantly, from an import perspective, in this imaginary case, this example, we have no particular reinforcement trigger identified yet on the import. There's still capacity, there's still import capacity on this particular piece of network. But importantly, if we look at export, we're approaching our limits. So there is a reinforcement trigger identified. In this particular case, 20 megawatts could still get connected, so there's still 20 megawatts of export capacity available, but that block, so those in the kind of purple color, are interactive with one another. So at this moment in time, they're interactive. They can't move forward. All those schemes can't move forward. It would be ultimately one that would move forward and follow the defined interactivity process. So in this case, if we said, well, okay, we've got a new demand customer coming in, they're just purely looking to have a demand contract, whether that's firm demand or some sort of flexible contract. Ultimately, if they're only looking to import, then at this moment in time, up to 12 megawatts, there's no constraint. So ultimately, the demand would enter into the import queue and can progress to acceptance because ultimately the reinforcement trigger only applies to export. Now, they would go in, they wouldn't be interactive. The offer would be open for as long as for as long as the validity period, which was stated in the offer itself. The only thing that could happen during that phase is it becomes interactive with another scheme, but they would be ultimately at the top end of that interactive queue. So ultimately, they'd be in a situation where they could move forward. So that's kind of quite a simplistic view, but it gives you a baseline on which I just wanted to get that into your talk through that and kind of get that articulated. If we then move down onto slide 7, this is now just showing that 12 megawatts demand now firmly in that import queue. When I say it's a queue, there's a queue there because as we move into construction, you'd stay within a particular order. We'll all keep you in a particular order at that initial stage, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you were looking to move forward more quickly than others ahead, that it then goes into the construction rules and more on that particular type of queue management. Ultimately, at this stage, what we are saying here is that customer has an offer that can be accepted and move forward. If I go into slide 8, this is now looking at storage, a storage example. Now, that storage example, that was already sitting in that queue that I showed earlier on. So we're now looking at a customer who, quite simply, is in both import and export queues. So on the import side, they're still fine. They're actually, in terms of application date, ahead of that 12 megawatts demand. That is not a problem. They can ultimately move forward from an import perspective. It's the export perspective that is an issue. Now, importantly, that's the export perspective, the export that was stated on that application form. So in terms of what was studied, it would generally been a case of whatever was asked for at the time, in terms of how they were going to operate. So if they were looking to operate at 20 megawatts full export in that particular case, then ultimately they have to be interactive. The question at the moment is, under what circumstances could that customer be promoted? In terms of discrimination, we as an industry are certainly wanting to ideally move away from that concept. That's not something we really want to explore, because positive discrimination doesn't ultimately deliver the best whole system solution. So, but are there other cases where actually this customer could be promoted? And one option, for example, would be if that storage customer didn't require to have 20 megawatts of export at all times. So if there was an opportunity to say, well, ultimately it will be curtailed and can only be exporting within a particular, outside of whatever that particular reinforcement constraint is, at the times that reinforcement constraint, is that an opportunity to be explored? And that is something that, one of the many options that we want to look at as part of Product 11, which is looking at that, you're providing that report and doing that piece of analysis. But here we're looking to also understand, are there any examples that our stakeholders have which are more relevant to today? When we're going back to the EFR days, a lot of things have changed. We've got new contracts out there. We want to understand more recently if if there have been any success in trialing that out, or have there been cases where actually you've been in that exact situation, or have customers in that situation, and have some feedback that you can provide to the industry that kind of supports our movement with a particular piece. So if I then go on to slide 9, that's ultimately the same slide. It's just saying exactly what I said there. If the contract was limited, export at time of network limits are breached with this advance as in the demand example. So really we're trying to say, is the queue itself the thing that is being prohibitive, or is it actually more around understanding what understanding what the market is? So from a customer's perspective, having that visibility of what the market requirements are, what the situation is in that particular part of the network, and from a licensee's perspective, understanding what it really is, what is the business case from a high level, and understanding ultimately what that customer needs to make that connection work for them. So yeah, there are certainly questions and thinking around that, but conscious that we're moving in that, we're talking about that and gaining some feedback from stakeholders, but the idea is to try and get more feedback through a particular piece of work. So at this moment in time, I just want to, before I go on to the kind of key findings, just open up and have some discussion and find out if there are any questions at this stage on that opportunity. Is it clear, and do people feel that actually, yep, they do have some thoughts, and either they can share them on the call, or if it's something that you want to put into the consultation response, then that's great. But it'd be great to hear any feedback, early feedback just now. So if there are any questions, if you're just able to pop them into the chat, then Jason will be able to pick those up, hopefully.
I think everyone is stunned by the quality of your presentation, Kyle, and we don't have any questions into the everyone boxes yet. Okay.
Well, I'll move on at the moment, and if there are any questions that pop up, then we can certainly go back and address them.
Absolutely. I think that's the best thing to do. I'm talking a bit to give opportunity for people to type, but we don't have anything. We have Helen's question from earlier, which hopefully, again, we can address through here. So Helen, if Kyle gives his discussion around key findings, if you can listen to that and identify any particular questions you might want to target after this slide. Maybe again, Kyle, it's time to pause after this slide as well.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of key findings, I'll give you a bit of background on how we were able to ultimately pull together those findings. The working group, which basically consists of myself and a number of other participants, from covering pretty much every DNO license and also the National Grid, sat down and formulated some questions that we wanted to ask our internal businesses. So we went out to the internal businesses and asked those series of questions, making sure they were consistent and fairly clear, so that our businesses could respond to those. And those questions were fairly wide and did start to go into quite a lot of detail fairly quickly in terms of responses. So what we've tried to do in this particular piece is ultimately present the high level findings. We didn't know really what we were going to get at the time, and I think from a kind of higher level, that there's, it's quite a statement to say that DNOs believe that the treatment of flexibility is, all technologies are ultimately treated the same, and if you were looking to ultimately providing a flexibility service, that there are no real deviations from the initial application process. The application process is something that is a given, and ultimately all DNOs follow that particular process for any flexibility or storage, for example. The question here was focusing more on storage because that's what the 1.6, the Action 1.6 of the Smarter Flexibility Plan focused on, but it was also opened up to ultimately any technology, being technology agnostic. So the findings were that ELDNO said, actually, from a baseline, we all take applications in the same way, whether at that particular level. So you'd be following a similar process for that technology. If ultimately most are following a kind of generation sort of timescales and processes. And really the only differences are when you start to get down into the analysis stage. So where which ultimately does, while we're trying to be technology agnostic, you have to start to go down the route of focusing on those key specifics. So in terms of storage, because you've got import and export, that's obviously something that has to be analysed, but also the ramp rate. So how quickly you're going to move from your full export, for example, to your full import is something that is quite important. So that, for example, would be modelled by the network, and that could be something that actually leads to falling underneath as a constraint. So you're ultimately not able to connect on that particular piece of the network because actually being able to switch so quickly is something that has a negative impact. Now, in terms of those details, that's where there will start to be some deviation in terms of the modelling itself. But generally speaking, there was, while that's something we're going to look at in a bit more detail in the next phase, the variations were generally small. So in terms of the actual output and what the customer received, then the process itself was believed, certainly from the material that was presented back, to be very, very similar and quite consistent. In terms of the offerings, in terms of information that's available, etc., that wasn't included with that particular question, but generally speaking, there is a movement to trying to get more similar information available. There's another piece of work that's looking at what is best practice, what DNOs should be, and also National Grid, what ultimately should be being presented from DNOs to enable customers to have the information available to define their business case and articulate that on any connection application. But while it is a separate piece of work, any feedback we get on that will ultimately be passed to that particular working group as well. So we want to make sure that while we're very focused on flexibility in a queue and that defined piece of that defined block in the queue process, any feedback we get on the more general experiences will certainly be passed to the relevant parties. So I just wanted to say that just now. In terms of the next two, in terms of how do you treat formal connection applications for flexibility, DG, storage, DSR, load, etc., in a constrained area versus a unconstrained area. Ultimately, though, again, there was quite a lot of consistency there. Any form of connection application processed ultimately in the same manner by each DNO. The connection will be designed to accommodate the full import and export requirements of the application, and any works required to accommodate this under passive operation will be identified. So really what we're talking about there is that, again, whatever stated on the initial application would be processed, would be analysed, and any works required, so any wider works or reinforcement schemes, etc., that are required within identified at that stage would then be identified. In most cases, so where that is significantly more expensive than usual, or if the customer is able to express an early preference for alternative or flexible connections, that was what would be offered. Now, while that was fairly consistent in terms of the offering was fairly consistent, but in terms of the process and the stage at which that happens was something that we felt was varied. So that was an important point to pick up. So where some DNOs would try and identify that fairly early on and communicate that through a more formal channel, or try to offer DG surgeries, etc., there were other options, other cases where actually, yes, the information was provided, but it was further on down the line. So the analysis had maybe been done by that point in quite a bit of detail, and it was then discussed with the customer further on the line. So there was some variation there when you got to that detail, but again, that the high-level approach is the same. And in terms of looking at an unconstrained area, so ultimately, if a customer came along and it wasn't constrained, then do we offer a solution that matches what's required, what the requirements were on that application form. So what we're looking to do now, while these are fairly high-level findings, we've deliberately not gone into the nitty-gritty detail, which is recorded, and that is something that we will be publishing shortly. We had a discussion at the last meeting and agreed that while we wouldn't call out exactly what each DNO does, highlighting what those, the questions that were actually asked and the ultimate responses to each of those will be shared. But what we were looking for here is to say, right, okay, well, from a high level, it looks like while we're not admitting to having a solution that is, that's got all the bells and whistles. There are variations, and that's something that the next piece of work wants to not only identify but understand how we plug those gaps and have some sort of alignment where necessary. It's important that if there are cases where there are variations but there's no negative or positive impact on customers ultimately and the whole system, then there's an argument that that particular variation may be valid. But we have identified some areas where we believe there can be more synergies. But ultimately, we're saying, right, okay, well, that's quite a lot of detail, and that's something we do need to explore. But from looking at the high-level approaches, we're looking to try and understand from the wider stakeholders whether this is something that actually, yes, you do agree with. So in terms of that question 5, it's really directing at, okay, from a high level, do you actually agree with this principle, or do you find that while the initial stages are maybe aligned relatively well to some extent, as soon as you start to get into the details, the detail that is actually more of the either the issue or the opportunity, having, particularly if you've got experience between a couple of different DNOs or a couple of different situations, are there variations that you can highlight or even experiences that you can say, well, actually, there are, from our experience, there's maybe either an opportunity or there's an area where it seems to be more prohibitive. Now, that might be something you don't have full visibility of the details, but that's an area that this particular working group could look into, and not specifically that case. So we're not looking for very specific case-by-case basis and live connection programs, but we're looking more at the kind of general, going through that particular process with a particular scheme and understanding that experience, and maybe it's not just looking at any negative approaches. It's also understanding, if there's an approach which really worked well in a particular DNO, and it's something you want to explore more, but maybe had to ask a question, or it wasn't clear from the beginning. That's something we want to take on and run with, because in terms of understanding what it is that stakeholders really require is going to be key, particularly as we start, as I described earlier, in terms of treating storage. When we get to storage and any flexibility service, you start to do more and more analysis, because the potential variation and what the impact it could have on the network only increases. And if we've now got loads now acting very differently from how it would have operated in the past in terms of the kind of general profiles, that's something that we have to understand. And the more information we can have from customers on how they want to operate is really valid. We also understand that the information has to be given the other way, so that there's clarity and a business case can be built up. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what the key findings were, and an idea of why we're not going any further at this stage. What that question 5 is really looking at is what's there in that document. But as an aside, the additional information will be circulated shortly. So that will be something that we can also circulate as well as part of this response, in terms of the formal question responses. So I believe I did notice that on the screen a couple of things popped up in terms of additional questions. So Jason, are you able to run through those, please?
Yes, I think maybe the first thing to ask is back to Helen.
Yep.
Clearly, there we go. I was going to start with Helen to see whether it answers her question. So she's asked Kyle. Then we'll come back to, we have an anonymous question in through to admin as well.
Okay.
Question 5 talks about market certainty, tender requirements, service availability, and TV network constraints.
Yep.
Helen was just struggling to find the reference to these points in the main document. Will that be in the additional information to be published?
So yes, it will be. Actually, I'll just skip to the questions. So it's question 5. That's the question 5 on the call for evidence there. So yes, okay. So no, I definitely take that point. So in terms of that wording that's used in terms of market uncertainty, tender requirements, service availability, TV network constraints, that's really coming off the back of that feedback we got from the DNOs, was that in terms of the issue in itself wasn't necessarily focused on that queue. There does seem to be commonality between all the DNOs to an extent, as I said, but focusing on where the market's at in terms of the tender requirements, what was actually on offer, service availability, capacity, etc. Did seem to be the things that we believed as a group could potentially be the opportunities. If we're able to address those, is that something that can get us moving forward and give more certainty to the stakeholders that are then able to ultimately translate that into the offer or the early information that's available. It could be that you say, well, actually the application form itself doesn't necessarily stack up. So that's really what we're looking at there. But in terms of that wording, yeah, I agree. It doesn't necessarily link back. That's a very good spot. So thanks for that, Helen. The additional information, though, will certainly go into. We'll highlight that wording in the separate piece.
Well, Kyle, you got a thank you very clear now smiley face. So I think
good.
Explanation. Anything else around the key findings page? Kyle, we also had a question again around case study, which might go back to the diagrams again. The question is, could any of the export assets commit to exporting at specific unconstrained times? If technically possible, why would you only consider fast-tracking storage?
So, very good question. So although we've articulated storage in this particular example, mainly to make it fairly simple to show it, it definitely isn't just for storage. While the Action 1.6 specifically stated storage from off-German bays, we've agreed as part of this working group to look at any DDR services. So it's not the technology really we're focusing on, it's more the service. But at this stage, because those service provisions aren't fully defined yet in terms of what they actually are and what the DNOs are calling them, in this diagram I've used what would traditionally be noted in terms of whether it's demand, storage, diesel or gas, more the technology itself. Now, in these particular examples, if you're 100% correct, if that diesel generation said, well, actually, look at us, we're actually happy to not export 20 megawatts full, 100% of the time, have a fully unconstrained offer. We'll have not only a constrained offer, so you'd be potentially off following the first fault on that particular piece of the network. We're also happy to say we'll only operate in during a particular time or avoid times of high export capacity. Then that is something that is being also explored as this particular piece. So while the diagram itself kind of discusses storage, I try to do that because it covers two birds with one stone. It covers the export and also the import element and having two separate queues. But as this particular piece is looking very much at any opportunity to, from a flexibility set point of view, and that word it does cover, diesel. I'm not so sure whether there'll be quite as many new diesel applications of that sort of size, but certainly anybody who's looking for exporting, but whether it was gas, wind, whatever, that said, well, actually we're quite confident that we can build our business model around a particular constraint, and therefore we can work around it. Then if that was that particular wind connection, for example, or the gas connection, the diesel connection was saying, no, we need to actually be 100% of the time, that's what we are asking for, then there would be no reason why that gas customer couldn't ultimately move forward. But we're trying to work out what the rules are behind that, so that's something we are investigating as part of the next piece of work. So, no, that was a good question. Hopefully that kind of covers the response.
I think that was a very good explanation, Carl. Hopefully, again, I think we've been clear in most of our work out of open networks that, while storage has been highlighted in a number of areas, particularly in smart systems and flexibility plan, we talk about flexibility resources and flexibility services without particularly picking out storage. So it was an example in this particular case, and storage is an easy example for us to use to go between import and export. So thank you for explaining that, Carl. Should we move on now, just conscious of time, to give a little bit of time for people to ask Q&A at the end as well?
Yep, sure. So the next slide was really just looking at the timeline, and the blue is put at 10. So that's basically this piece of work that we're consulting on, going to the call for evidence for today. And then put at 11, which is taking that further forward. So it's looking at that, doing that analysis between where we are now, where we need to go, looking at the medium to longer term, providing that guide for customers, that early connections guide, which focuses really on looking at flexibility services, so flexibility resources. So if you are looking to go down that particular route, giving you either articulating the core information that you really should need at that particular point when building the business case up, and directing to any existing information. That next piece coming out of the back of those gaps is then identifying, saying, right, okay, well, how are we going to close any of those gaps in inverted commas? So it's not necessarily gaps from existing gaps, between different licenses. There's an element of that, but it's also going further to say, right, well, that's something we can maybe address in the kind of short term, in some cases to medium term. But what are we looking medium to longer term? Where is this topic going? Ultimately, what are we trying to achieve longer term? What can be picked up later by this particular working group within Open Networks, or any future work done in this particular area? So we realise there's lots of work going on as well, so we don't want to commit to doing everything in 1 year and then it's not relevant. It's important to try and take on as much information as we can at this particular time, let other groups as well, in terms of the queue management, the information we're committing to getting out to customers at the initial stage, or pre-application, and then understanding, okay, what impact does that have, and can take that work further forward. So later on, when all this information comes out and is published, it's going to be much later on in the year, around about the September, October time. And then when we move into November, we'll be looking at doing another webinar at that particular point for this group. There's no specific consultation defined for this particular piece of work. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a wider queue management piece to make sure that we are kind of linking up. I'm also on that group as well, so we are ensuring that what's covered in this work we've defined isn't being duplicated, but at the same time they can be married together. The intention, therefore, is to go out to consultation later in the year on the wider work that's been done on queue management, moving flexibility queue, all those topics, and then getting some responses back as a kind of combined piece to make it much easier for stakeholders to ultimately pick up and and work through, it also makes it an awful lot easier for the working group as well. So hopefully by doing that, you can see how any feedback given right now can be picked up, has been picked up, run through the particular process, responses and findings presented near the end of the year on the back of that, back of those bits of feedback, and then kind of combined with the other work that's been done in the industry, specifically within open networks, and a time to respond kind of later on in the year, and that will then inform how we then move forward with the broader piece of work on queue management and movement of flexibility into 2019 and beyond. Importantly, that particular roadmap that we're creating as well, while might be picked up by open networks, it will also be looked at with the likes of other off-gem working groups, and ultimately the wider industry, the people who are going to be able to take on this information, take on these findings, and actually then lead to code changes or whatever we need to do to make sure this actually does move forward and actually happens. So it's not just going to be a standalone, a document that doesn't go anywhere. There's already plans on how we're going to make sure that that moves forward and is picked up elsewhere. So we can obviously run through into question 5 earlier, but these are the questions that are ultimately in that call for evidence. I can just bring them up here and just kind of run through them fairly quickly, just to get a flavour on what we're looking for in this particular call for evidence. So the first one is really looking at under what circumstances do you think customers, flexibility storage service providers should be connected ahead of other resources to enable better use of existing capacity? Quite a broad question. The first part of that sentence is quite important, under what circumstances. So it's really, we have an idea of where, I've already talked about some of the opportunities that we have to say, right, in this particular case is a clear, that customer is saying we're happy to go for some sort of time connection or constrained connection. There might be another opportunity which says actually, okay, there are two customers that are willing to both contract now and actually move forward together. Again, there's still questions on how both of these actually would work. But we're looking to understand as well if there are any other circumstances that you feel, well, actually, there's an opportunity here, whatever that happens to be, for flexibility to move forward and connect ahead of either more traditional connections or connections that are looking for, have different needs ultimately. It comes back to this kind of the needs of the actual scheme itself. Really good to get feedback on that. Then when we go into where do you believe the opportunities lie in the existing connection processes for storage and other DER to be connected ahead of resources so they can enable better use of the existing network capacity. So subtle differences between the first two. This one's looking much more about the existing process. So where there's an opportunity in the first one to talk about wider kind of new, more medium-term potentially options. Some of those could be covered. We're not just focusing on medium-term there, but it is likely that if we're talking about having, for example, a queue which is more around a kind of more neural network, so we're actually using a lot of analytics in that particular process, that might be something that could be answered or comes up in question 1. But question 2 is much more about, okay, we've got a process here. What can we do now to ultimately get DER and storage connecting ahead of other resources? So anyone's offering that sort of flexible connection, what do you see any opportunities? It could be from personal previous experience on being able to connect a particular service and saying, well, actually, we've got an example here, or it could just be saying, well, actually, from knowing our part of the industry, we believe there's an opportunity in this particular area that we want to be, we want to address. Importantly, this is more for stakeholders themselves, not the DNOs to respond to, because we've already got our feedback and where we believe there are opportunities. Is then understanding, okay, what do we get? We don't want to kind of preempt it too much, so we've not presented what exactly those are in that list. We're trying to get your feedback on that fairly early on. Then, do you think that the work proposed under the facility connections, so this particular piece of work, good practice guide ahead of connection applications, which is talking about the information that's presented ahead of customers connecting, and that good practice following connection applications, workstream 2.5. These are all the bits of work that are being done or committed to as part of Open Networks in this year that all relate to one another. Importantly, in the document itself, there's a link to the project initiation document. So if you want a bit of clearer understanding of what exactly has been delivered under those three, there is a document on the ENA website which gives you that, but it's all contained within the call for evidence paper itself. We're really trying to understand, does this go far enough in your eyes? I've kind of articulated where we think, what we've planned, what we're trying to do by the end of this year, where it might go going forward. But if you feel that's not going to cover, there's a gap in that particular, what we're aiming to cover just now, again, it would be really important to highlight that. We did go out in the initial PID consultation, so there was a consultation earlier in the year looking at our work plan, and generally the feedback was that that there were potential gaps for this, but it seemed like a big piece of work overall, and there was potential for gaps, but it didn't really drill down to what those might be. So we're looking to understand, okay, can anybody go a little bit further and give us that type of feedback. Then when we go to 4, so that's with promotion of flexibility in mind, does the definition of the problem outlined in this call for evidence report align with your thinking? So that promotion of flexibility definition of the problem was really what we covered earlier on in those kind of fairly high level diagrams, showing those two, the import and export queue. What we're talking about there in terms of moving in a queue and that type of process, does that actually define the problem as you see it, or the opportunity as you see it? Or we missed the point slightly? Are there other complexities that might not be shown in the diagram because it was too difficult to do so, but that you feel that really need to be, because if we don't include them, then actually we could be missing a trick in some cases, or potentially developing a solution that doesn't cover all all experiences and all offerings within the current industry. 5 we've kind of covered, so we won't go through that one again. And then 6, the next page includes detailed gap analysis, roadmap, good practice guide, action plan, etc. And what information could be included as part of these outputs to provide customers with the tools to help progress to the connections queue. That's going to be quite important because we're writing a document at the moment. We've already kicked that piece off, which is exactly that, the guide that we discussed earlier on, the kind of end-to-end guide to give customers a good understanding of where to start if they're looking at gaining flexibility, a flexibility connection in any DNO or indeed connecting to transmission. Now, while we started to kind of believe that, co-location, for example, is something that's going to be important. If someone was wanted to have combined technologies or have two different services side by side, and that's going to be something that they will need to cover. But while we've walked through a lot of those, these are things that we believe and we can see coming up more and more through our connection teams. It's the sort of feedback we're getting from our connections teams directly. But there may be other elements that you feel, well, actually, we want to have that included. Now, instead of listing out what we've currently got on the list, it would be good really to understand what do you believe is important, because we can then pick those up, can rationalise those and understand if there are any gaps in our current listings, and redirect efforts where required so that we can ultimately answer the questions that are out there, not the questions that we believe are there. So ultimately, that's the questions we've got in the document themselves. As I said, there is other supporting information in the call for evidence, so certainly we would recommend kind of reading through that, and then ideally looking at those questions and providing a response would be great. To find that consultation, I can share the link with you here. It's ultimately on the ENA's website under Open Networks. So if you are able to, even if you were searching for it through a search engine, Open Networks, ENA Open Networks project would take you to it's the first one that comes up, and then on the left hand side there's a fairly simple menu that will take you through to Open Networks project, stakeholder engagement, and public consultation. So it's fairly intuitive, but just to know that it's down under the public consultation block, and all the information is there in terms of how to download the report. So there's a link there to download the report and questions, and then also the link on how to ultimately respond and provide that information back to the ENA. As I said before, the closing date for that for those responses is Monday the 11th of June, so still a little bit of time, but yeah, also a busy part of the year as well, so time's certainly advancing on. So we've got a couple of weeks left, and then that will be closing at 5 p.m. on that day. But certainly, if there are any other questions when you're starting to go through the document, then certainly if you pass them on to the ENA, it'll either be answered directly from the ENA, if it's more of a question relating to the process and of feeding the information back, or it'll be passed on directly to myself for either me or the wider group to pick up. So if there is anything, then we should try and we'll try and support as best we can. But if there are any questions right now, then that would be a good opportunity to send in any other questions that the group has.
Thanks, Carl. That beep was me again, coming off mute. So
okay.
We're just about out of time. We haven't had any questions coming in typed in whilst you've been running through the questions in the com box. So we'll just give a quick 30 seconds if anyone would like to ask a quick question now. Otherwise, I will do a wrap-up. As Carl has said, the contact details for any questions are at the end of that slide deck. So I think it just leaves for me to say thank you, everyone, for dialing in. Thank you for making the time this week. Apologies again for last week, but hopefully you've all got a lot out of today's teleconference. So thank you all for dialing in, and thank you, Carl, for leading the discussion today. I think we will close down the webinar now and look forward to future webinars for other consultations and other information dissemination out of the project. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jason, and again, thank you from me for everyone dialing in.